All right, well, it is 7 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kara Solomon, and I'm a conservation coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. I am here tonight with one of our community wildlife chapters, the Tri-County Conservationists. I'm going to be your moderator tonight, so if you have any questions at any point during the presentation, you can go ahead and put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I will read your questions aloud to our speaker at the end of his presentation. Um, yeah, so I'm excited to be with you all tonight. I'm going to pass the microphone on to one of the chapter leaders of the Tri-County Conservationists, Laura Kiefer.
Thanks, Kara. Yes, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar tonight. Glad to have you. I'm the treasurer of the Tri-County Conservationists Chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. We're a volunteer group focused on restoring wildlife habitat in Orange, Chatham, and Alamance counties. We have events to remove invasive plants in parks and nature preserves. We plant native plants back into the parks, and we hold educational events like this one to learn about wildlife and what we can all do to help wildlife and preserve green spaces. We're always welcoming new members to our chapter, and actually we're having our last invasive plant removal event this year, Sunday in Hillsborough from 1 to 3, and Kara is going to put that registration link for that event in the chat box if you're interested. You can also find the registration link for that event and all upcoming events for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation on their website, on the North Carolina Wildlife Federation website. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Clyde Sorenson, who will be speaking about the charismatic fireflies. Professor Sorenson is an Alumni Association Distinguished Undergraduate Professor of Entomology at North Carolina State University, where he also earned his Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Biology and his PhD in Entomology. He joined the North Carolina State faculty in 1996. He has spent his career studying insect ecology in both agricultural settings and in North Carolina's diverse ecosystems, particularly longleaf pine savanna systems. Professor Sorenson teaches extensively at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. Over the past 8 years, his childhood fascination with lightning bugs has been rekindled, and he has been working on understanding the diversity of these incredible creatures in North Carolina. We are very grateful that Professor Sorenson is with us tonight. The title of his presentation is Carolina Ghosts, Synchronous Shows, and Foxfire Nights, the Bioluminescent Insects of North Carolina. With that, I'll turn the presentation over to you, Professor Sorenson.
All right, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and see if I can share back to where we need to be. There we are. Hopefully. Are we in the right spot? Everybody see the full screen, I hope. All right, so I'm going to talk to you tonight about fireflies. Let me get my fireflies out of the way here. And other insects that are bioluminescent in the state. So let's start off by first talking about what bioluminescence is. And so bioluminescence is pretty simply, it's light production by a living thing. And it's really cool because it's actually really cool. It's cold light. And so the general way light is produced by a living thing is with a chemical called luciferin. There's a whole family of luciferins that make different colors of light. And in order for luciferin to produce light, it needs oxygen. It needs an enzyme called luciferase, and it needs an energy source, and that energy source is the same energy source that drives all cellular activity, ATP. And bioluminescent organisms can regulate that production of light by regulating oxygen into the system, we think, or perhaps for some groups, they can regulate it through manipulating the energy that's available to the system. So lots of things are bioluminescent in addition to insects. So there are bioluminescent fish, snails, centipedes. Right here in North Carolina, you can see several different bioluminescent fungi. dinoflagellates. I don't know if anybody's had the experience of being like at Bear Island and in the middle of the night and rubbing your foot across the sand and seeing the sand glow. Those are dinoflagellates doing that. And bacteria. Lots of other organisms produce light um, in addition to insects. When we talk about bioluminescent fish, by the way, it's kind of neat to know that some of those fish are bioluminescent because they basically hijack bacteria to make their light for them. But of course, probably the most familiar bioluminescent organisms to most of us are fireflies, or you may call them lightning bugs. So, what exactly is a firefly? So, fireflies actually are not flies, and lightning bugs are not bugs. They're actually soft-winged beetles in the family Lampyridae. And Lampyridae means light bearer. The ancient Greeks called him Chysolampus, and that means translates roughly to the one with the glowing butt. They're really closely related to a couple other groups of beetles that also are occasionally bioluminescent. There's the fangodids, we'll talk a little bit about them later, the glowworms, and then some click beetles in some parts of the world are bioluminescent as well. In addition to fireflies and fangodids, we do have at least one other group of one other kind of bioluminescent insect. We'll talk more about them a little bit later in North Carolina. So when we talk about fireflies, if you want to study fireflies, if you want to be able to identify them, there are some important structures on the firefly that you need to be familiar with. And so I'm going to give you a real brief introduction to the anatomy of fireflies, at least those pieces that are helpful for when we're trying to identify them. And of course, fireflies have antennae like all insects do. The color of those antennae, the shape of the little antennomeres, the little segments, that can all be very useful in helping to identify a particular species. Fireflies have compound eyes, again, like most insects. And what you'll notice if you study fireflies is that the males typically have much larger eyes than the females because they're looking for females oftentimes that are partially hidden. And again, the shape of their eyes can sometimes help you figure out who you're looking at. This structure right here, right behind the head, is called the pronotum. And this is part of the insect's thorax. The shape of that pronotum and the coloring on that pronotum can be really, really useful in helping you sort out the firefly that you're looking at. Behind that, there's another little tiny structure here called the scutellum. And the scutellum, the color of it, the shape of it, again can be a clue to helping identify a firefly. The front wings of a firefly, like all beetles, are called elytra. The singular is elytron. And in fireflies, the shape of the elytra, the color of the elytra, markings that might be on the elytra, and the presence or the absence of this little side fold called the elytral fold, all can help you understand who you're looking at. From the underside, the color of the thorax, the color of the legs can be important clues to identifying a firefly. The color of the abdomen can be a very important clue to identifying a firefly. And the shape and extent of the light organs can be very useful. In a lot of fireflies, it's not on this one, but in a lot of fireflies, you'll notice in the light organs that there are little pits, and the presence or absence of those little pits might be useful as well. And then finally, this structure at the very end is called the pygidium. This is kind of the tail of the firefly. The shape of that and the coloration of that can also help you identify who you're looking at. Now, if we want to talk about the diversity of fireflies in the world, there are maybe a couple thousand species of fireflies. In the U.S., we have about 170 species of fireflies in 20 or so genera. So genera are um, significant groups of species. And then in North Carolina, we have somewhere between 30 and 50. And you might think that's a pretty broad range right there, 30 to 50. Why is it so broad? Well, it's broad because we really don't know exactly how many species we have here. We do have at least 30, 33 species, but it's almost certain that we have quite a few more species that haven't either been identified or, for that matter, even classified yet. When we look at the prominent groups of fireflies in North Carolina, the prominent genera of fireflies in North Carolina, probably the most familiar is Photinus. And so that's a good example of Photinus right there. The most common firefly in most people's yards belongs to this group. That's one we call the Big Dipper. We'll talk more about a little bit later. So most of the Photinus look very similar to this guy, with relatively narrow, straight elytra and a shield that usually has some sort of a dark mark and pink or red markings around that. Another prominent genus here is the Photuris genus. This is a good characteristic Photuris. Photuris tend to be bigger. They tend to oftentimes have really long legs. And if you look at them from the side, they kind of look hunchbacked. And then the coloring and the shape of the marks on their pronotum can also be very useful in helping trying to sort out them. Pyractomina is another genus that we have prominently in North Carolina. Amongst this genus are the earliest fireflies that we see in the spring. So one of these species often starts flying in March. And then the fourth genus that's fairly conspicuous in North Carolina of glowing fireflies is the genus Phausis, or the ghost fireflies. And we'll talk more about them a little bit later. So this is the catalog of known species of fireflies in North Carolina right now. And that comes up to about 32, I think, species. Now, I want you to notice that some of those species names are in blue. And there's a good reason for that, and I'm going to get to it in a minute. But just for the time being, don't worry about remembering those species. Just kind of get a feel for how many of those species are in blue. Okay, so the reason those were in blue is that they are species of fireflies that aren't lightning bugs. So about a quarter of the species of lampreyrids aren't fireflies or lightning bugs at all. They don't have lights, and they're day-flying animals. They look more or less like regular fireflies, except they don't have lamps. And these species tend to, as far as we can tell, rely on pheromones for communication instead of light. Now, you might ask, well, how do you end up with day-flying, lightless fireflies? And as it turns out, it looks like most of these species actually evolved from ancestors that did have lights, but they lost their lights in response to the evolutionary pressure of nighttime predators like bats. So that's kind of cool. There are a few species that have females that glow, but the males are dark. And so in these species, the dark males just fly around looking for their little glowing females down on the forest floor. This is one of the more common dark fireflies. This is Lucidota. I have these in my yard. You may well have them in your yard. This is another one. This is the winter firefly. This is one that you can often see on mild days aggregating on trees. I took this picture here at Grandfather Mountain, by the way. And then this is another one of the dark fireflies. This is a little teeny tiny guy, a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch long, called Pyropyga, that I have in my backyard as well. So some fireflies aren't lightning bugs. Beyond that, there are lots of things that look like fireflies that aren't fireflies at all. So there are a great many insects that mimic fireflies because of their chemical protection that we'll talk about a little bit later, called lucibufficants. And so this is a click beetle that mimics fireflies. That's a soldier beetle that mimics fireflies. That's a longhorn beetle that mimics fireflies. And that's a ground beetle that is a firefly mimic. Some other insects get into the act too. So there's a moth that actually mimics fireflies, trying to take advantage of the fact that fireflies, many fireflies anyway, are heavily protected by toxic chemicals. All right, so let's go back to fireflies. We talked about 13 seconds about moths. Let's go back to talking about fireflies. And in general, fireflies are predators, but mostly only as larvae, right? But the larvae are extraordinary and extraordinarily vigorous predators. So, as you might have guessed, firefly larvae, for the most part, are pretty small animals. But you can have a firefly a firefly larva that's maybe a ½ inch long, actually subduing an earthworm that's 3 or 4 inches long, or a snail that's bigger than a quarter. They're really interesting predators in that respect. Fireflies occur in a wide range of habitats. We'll talk more about this towards the end of this talk as well. For a lot of species, mature native forests are really, really critical habitats. There are some species that are associated with wetlands. One thing that I'm concerned about, and we can talk about a little bit later, is the impact that invasive plants, some of those same plants that y'all are going to be removing on the 15th, may have negative effects on fireflies. In about half, or well, probably 3/4 of fireflies, the females have wings and are capable of flight. But in a lot of species, the females are wingless, kind of larviform creatures that don't look very much at all like a beetle. And I'll show you an example a little bit later. In the vast majority of species, with a couple notable exceptions, the adults don't feed. In most fireflies, the sole mission of the adults is to find a mate and leave genes for the next generation to carry on. So in most adult species of fireflies, the adults don't eat. This is a firefly larva, so you can get an idea of what they look like. They kind of remind me of little alligators, and they're probably just about as efficient as predators as alligators are. All right, so we'll talk more about natural history and life histories in a minute, but let's talk first a little bit about the lights and why they have lights. And so by our best understanding, this group of insects evolved the ability to produce light as an aposematic signal in the larvae about 141, 142 million years ago. So aposematism means a warning. And so we think that this ability to make light first evolved as as a warning in the larvae that they are toxic to predators. And then about 10 million years later, that signal that was used to warn predators of toxic larvae was co-opted by adult fireflies to become a signal that they could use in the air. And we think that this evolved very, very rapidly because of the tremendous utility it has for sexual communication amongst the adults at night. And bear in mind, this was happening at a time when there weren't birds or bats as aerial predators around. So a really, really, really long time ago. And of course, the lights now are used primarily for communication. And so that communication is almost totally about sex, about males finding females, advertising themselves to females, and for females to then advertise themselves back to the males. Now, when we look at firefly light, it's not all the same. So different genera tend to have different colored light. So the Photinus fireflies tend to have kind of yellowish lights. A lot of the Photuris tend to have kind of greenish lights. Some of the Pyracmina actually have sort of amber lights. So there can be variation in that. Within each genus, each species has its own signaling system. And we'll talk more about those signaling systems in a bit, but in general, in most of our species anyhow in North America, the way it works is the males fly around advertising themselves with their species-specific signal while they're looking for females in the appropriate habitat. So in a lot of species, the females will be on the ground or they may be in low vegetation. In some species, the females may be all the way up in the tops of the tree canopies. And so they'll be flying around, the males will be flying around looking for the females. The females are watching intently, if they're interested in mating, watching intently for male. And if they see a male that's making the right signal and doing it well, they're very discriminating. She'll respond back with her own signal, and that again is usually a species-specific signal. And so the male sees that signal, he flies in her direction, he continues to repeat his signal at the appropriate interval and in the appropriate way. She responds back, and then he'll eventually make his way to where she is, land very close to her, run over to her. They may do some handshaking or antenna touching or whatever. And we think that there may be other signals involved at that point, maybe some chemical signals, pheromone signals. And if everybody's happy, then they'll go ahead and mate. And in fireflies, at least in some species of fireflies, mating is an extraordinarily extended business. So some species of fireflies, the males and the females will stay coupled up for about 12 hours. And we'll talk about why that is directly. So you'll have to look at this very, very carefully. These 3 videos I'm going to show you, I took in my backyard and did them poorly. I'm sorry to say, but if you watch this video carefully, you'll see probably the most common firefly in most folks' yards, and that's Photinus pyralis. We call it the Big Dipper because it makes a J-shaped flash that lasts about a half second. So you should start seeing he's back here. He's going to be coming closer to the screen. There he was again. And there he was again. And there he was again. So you see that J-shaped flash that he's making, and there he is again. So he's making that flash at roughly, I think 3 or 4 second intervals. And the females are on the ground or in low vegetation watching for them. If she sees one that's doing it right, about halfway through that interval, she'll make a half second flash of her own, and the males will respond. And then if everything goes well, this happens. Well, not exactly this. This is a pair mating and a very, very frustrated additional male trying to horn in on the business. If you notice, there was another male in the back here that just made a signal as well. So these guys are going to stay coupled up for many hours. And there's an important reason for that. Let's go on. This is another species that I have in my backyard. We call this the double tap, and you'll have to again watch very carefully. The lights will start from the left side of the screen and go on. But in this species, the signal is two flashes in quick succession, followed by a dark period and then two more flashes. So there it was. And it should be right there. And then maybe a third series over here. So two flashes with a dark interval and then two flashes again. And this is the third species that I filmed in my backyard. This is Photuris frontalis. We call this the snappy sync firefly. This is a really cool firefly, by the way, because we're going to be talking about synchronous fireflies directly. This is another species that under in high population situations synchronizes in unison. But in this species, the males just keep flashing all the time. So he'll start out over here, and it's a very faint signal, unfortunately. But if you keep watching, you'll see one right there. He is right there, coming across there. And in this species, if the males can see each other, they'll flash in perfect unison. And the really cool thing happens in really high densities again. If you go to Congaree National Park at the right time of the year, which is in early May, there are thousands of these fireflies in the bottomland forest there, flashing in perfect synchrony, which is really, really cool. All right. So there are variations. There may be a delay between when the male signals and the female responds. In some species, notably in the genus Photuris, they may have multiple flash patterns, which can make it really, really confusing. And then some do other things with their lights, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, I real briefly introduce you to the anatomy of a firefly, but if you're trying to identify fireflies, the ones that have lights anyway, it's really important to make note of the flash patterns, because those flash patterns ultimately are going to help you figure out who you're looking at. There are some groups of fireflies where the species resemble each other so much that if you don't know what the flash pattern is, you're probably not going to figure out who it is. Now, I don't know how many of y'all have ever caught fireflies. I imagine almost all of you, at least when you were kids. And you may have noticed that they kind of smell a little weird. They have a kind of a funny kind of chemical smell. And we think that's related to the fact, at least in Photinus, and a couple other groups of fireflies, that they produce these steroidal chemicals called lucibufficants. And the smell's not the lucibufficants, because lucibufficants aren't terribly volatile, but we think it might be a breakdown product of these chemicals. And so lucibufficants are chemically related to the toxins that are produced on the skins of toads. They're synthesized de novo by the insects, but they're in the same chemical family as those toxins that you probably already know about on toads. And we know some toads have really, really potent toxins that can actually kill some mammals, mammalian predators, right? So those toxins are, as you might have guessed, toxic, but they're also really, really distasteful. And so predators that try to ingest a firefly often will almost immediately spit it back out because of the really bad taste. Several years ago, I convinced one of my graduate students to put one of the Photinus fireflies in his mouth on a bet, and he did it, and he reported that his mouth was well, first that it tasted awful, but that his mouth was numb for about 20 minutes because of the chemicals. We know that in other groups of fireflies, there's other chemistry There's probably other chemistry in our fireflies as well. But because they produce these chemicals, they're pretty well protected from most predators. There are things that will eat them. Spiders will eat some spiders anyway will eat fireflies. Occasionally toads will eat fireflies if they're really hungry. So there are some animals that will eat them, but most of they avoid them. Now, a lot of fireflies also, as part of their defensive strategy, reflexively bleed. So they leak that toxin onto the exterior of their bodies to maybe make that signal even more potent to a potential predator. So if you look at this firefly right here, this white stuff right here is toxins that have been leaked out. All right, so let's look at a couple examples of fireflies, different genera, and look at their life cycles. And we'll start off with one that's pretty famous, and that's the synchronous fireflies from the mountains in North Carolina and other parts of the Appalachians. And we ought to be really proud of it in North Carolina, by the way, because its scientific name is Photinus carolinus, the Carolina firefly. So this is the range of Photinus carolinus. You see that it covers most of the southern Appalachians and extends up into Pennsylvania. This is a firefly that relies to a very large extent on mature hardwood forests. If it doesn't have good, rich, moist, mature hardwood forests, it's not going to thrive. So if we want to talk about the life cycle of Photinus carolinus, we can start in the spring when the courtship flights begin. And when is that? So in at Elkmont in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park at about 2,000 feet, this happens around Memorial Day. If you go to Grandfather Mountain at 4,000 feet, it doesn't happen until almost a month later. So to start this process, the males are flying around at about 3 to 4 feet above the ground, looking for females that are down in the leaf litter below them. In this species, the male signal is 4 to 8 flashes, followed by about 6 seconds of darkness. And when they're under high population numbers, the flash periods and the dark periods are synchronized. So everybody flashes together, everybody goes dark together. The females are down on the ground, as I said, looking for males. If they see a male that appeals to them, they'll make their signal back. But on any given night, only a fraction of the female population will actually be up and interested in mating. So on most nights, and this is true for lots of other firefly species as well, on most nights, there's lots more males looking for mates than there are females interested in mating. So in Photinus carolinus, the female signal is 2 faint flashes about 3 seconds into the dark period, that 6-second dark spell. If male sees that signal, he's going to fly down. If it's a typical night and there's lots more males than there are females, a whole lot of males may fly down, and there you may end up with a ball of males around one female, all trying to mate with her. The males typically will only mate one time. They may, if they're lucky, mate twice, but the females can mate multiple times. And this is one of those species that stays coupled for a very long time, for about 12 hours. And that's necessary because the male is transferring during that period a huge nuptial gift in the form of a big slug of those toxins that we talked about. And also a whole lot of protein that the female can use to nourish her eggs. And so it takes a while to transfer through the mating process that huge nuptial gift. After the female's done mating, she'll lay a single batch of eggs with about 40 eggs in it, and then she dies. The typical adult in this species only lives for about 2.5 to 3 weeks. So those eggs hatch in about 3 weeks. The larvae which again are very vigorous predators, will live in the upper parts of the soil and under leaf litter, and they capture their prey with their large, sharp, hollow mandibles and the venom that they inject through those mandibles into their prey. So they basically bite their prey and paralyze it, very much like a spider does. By the way, the eggs glow, the larvae glow, and the pupae all glow, and they glow pretty much continuously. This species spends the winter as a larva. They pupate in the spring, starting in probably late March, early April, and then they emerge about 3 weeks later to start that cycle all over. And again, in this species, the adults don't feed. Like many other insects in this species, the males typically emerge earlier than the females, and they do that so that they're out and ready when the females start to show up. Another genus that's prominent in North Carolina and may be becoming more prominent is the genus Phausis. So we have at least 10, actually is probably closer to 15 species in this genus. These are really tiny, tiny fireflies. In almost all the species, the males are less than a 1/4 inch long. In all these species, I'll show you a picture in a minute, the females are wingless and larviform. And in all the species, whether the males are dark or have lights themselves, the females have light organs. And the number of those light organs can be an important thing in helping to determine who you're looking at. Most of these species are dark, so the males don't have light organs, but at least 2 or 3 species do have light organs. And with those light organs, they do something pretty spectacular. The most familiar of these species is the blue ghost firefly, Phausis reticulata. I don't know if anybody's had the chance to see these guys up in the mountains and the foothills, but it's something very, very much worth seeing. So this is a still photo of what blue ghosts do. Unlike the Photinus fireflies we just talked about, in the blue ghosts, the males keep their lights on sometimes for as much as a minute and a half. And so while they're flying around over the forest floor, a couple feet off the ground, looking for females, they keep their light on, and it looks like little fairies dancing through the woods. It's just magical, especially when you see really heavy densities of them. So the flightless females come up from their ground burrows in the spring. They only come up for a couple weeks. Each one of these species probably has a flight period that only lasts a couple weeks per cycle. The males, as I said, fly around over the forest floor looking for those females. If they see a female, they'll drop down, run over, and mate with her. The females, by the way, are sitting on the forest floor basically with their little butts in the air and their lights lit. They don't flash either. So we got a dimly glowing male flying around looking for a dimly glowing female down on the forest floor. So once she mates, she'll lay one cohort of eggs that typically has about 30 eggs in it. Then she curls her little body up around those eggs and guards them until she dies. And then those eggs will hatch usually a couple weeks after she's passed away. And again, those little predaceous larvae will make their living for about a year on soil invertebrates. This is a very poorly understood group of fireflies. There's lots of mystery about these guys to this day. So this is a pair of blue ghosts. That the dark one is the male, and the one that doesn't look like a beetle at all is the female. This is the Phausis reticulata from the mountains. Now, they're called blue ghosts because to the human eye, those lights look blue at any distance, but in actuality, the light's green. And it looks blue to us because of an optical illusion called the Purkinje effect, which basically says that any dim green light at any distance is going to shift towards the blue end of the spectrum, and so they look blue to us at a distance. All right, so I want to talk just a little bit now about an important, to me anyway, mystery, and that's got to do with a Phausis species that we don't know very much at all about. So just to familiarize you with this, this is Phausis reticulata, the underside. I want you to notice the shape of the pygidium here, the shape of the light organs. Notice the shape of the pronotum here. If you look at the back, you'll notice the pronotum's kind of dark and the elytra are heavily reticulated. This is the blue ghost that we've known about, and it's become very popular in the mountains for a while. The primary flight period in the mountains at, say, a 2,000-foot elevation is in mid-May, and then there's another peak in July. This is an insect we've known about for a very, very long time. Now, I'm going to tell you the story real quickly, and then I'll show you some more pictures. About almost 5 years ago now, I was alerted by a colleague of mine to the presence of, well, what was thought to be anyway, according to her, some blue ghost fireflies, but they weren't in the mountains. They were in Chatham County. And that's about 120 miles east of where any blue ghost fireflies had ever been seen before. So my wife and I went over to Chatham County, to this location, to this lady's front yard, and we got there about dusk, and we waited until it was full dark, and we were about to give up because we hadn't seen any of these putative ghost fireflies in this lady's yard. And my wife said, "Oh, there's one." And then we looked around, and in short order, we saw about a dozen little ghost fireflies flying around in this lady's front yard in Chatham County. Now, she did not want us collecting any of them because they were very special to her and her late husband. But we did catch one, and I took some pictures. And when I looked at those pictures up close, I said, these look a little bit different from what I'm familiar with our blue ghost in the mountains. So we started trying to find more locations where we could find them. Short order, we found a couple more populations in Chatham County from friends that had reached out to me. And then Jerry Reynolds at the Museum of Natural Sciences, who's a friend of mine and lives only about a mile from me here in Johnston County, said, "Well, you reckon I ought to look for them in my behind my house?" And I said, "What could it hurt?" So he went out the next night with a beer in hand, looking for blue ghosts. He walked down to the back gate of his yard and looked into the woods behind him, and he didn't see any. He said, "I don't have them." And so he went back up to the house and finished his beer. And I was very excited to hear what he might have found. And so I talked to him the next day, and he said, "No, I didn't find any." But then he started feeling guilty about not making a better effort. So the next night he went out again with a beer in hand. This time he opened the gate, walked up into the woods, and lo and behold, he had ghost fireflies in his backyard, which was terribly exciting to me. And then I realized that his backyard and my backyard look fairly similar. We both have hardwood forests behind our houses. And even though I'd lived in this house for, at that point in time, 24 years, it never occurred to me to look for ghost fireflies in my backyard. So the next night, I got a beer in my hand and went into the woods behind my house. And lo and behold, in Johnston County, I had ghost fireflies in my yard as well. So just goes to show you, you can be a trained entomologist, but if you don't open your eyes and look at the right time, you may not see really, really cool things. So this is our Piedmont ghost, and I want you to look at it carefully. Notice that it's paler, for one thing. Notice that this pygidium is shaped much differently from the true blue ghost. Notice that the light organs are smaller. Also notice that the pronotum is shaped differently. It's colored differently. The antennae are a different color. Basically, what I'm pretty sure we have here is a new species of ghost firefly, a species that's new to science. So we've launched a project to try and understand more about this critter. This is a female, by the way. And I should say in the mountain blue ghost, the females often have 6 or 8 light organs. In our Piedmont ghost, we've only ever seen 2 light spots. And so we've launched our little Carolina ghost hunt, and we sure would like for y'all to help us out. So it's very easy to find. Just Google Carolina ghost hunt. Not any point in doing it right now because there's not any ghost fireflies. It won't be until late April and early May of next year before we'll start seeing them again. But we're very interested in learning more about where these things occur, and what their flight periods are and what their populations are. And so right now, this is what our understanding of the distribution of this critter is. But there's lots of holes in there we'd like to fill. Importantly, next year, we're also going to be very interested in getting additional specimens of these ghost fireflies for some genetic analysis that we're going to do as part of our effort to try and identify it, make sure it's another species, and then give that new species a name. So if you're interested in this, you can certainly Google the Carolina ghost hunt, or you're more than welcome to drop me an email, and I would love to communicate with you, especially if you're interested in trying to collect some specimens for us. All right, so that was Phalcis. I'm going to talk about one more genus very briefly, and that's Photuris. So Photuris are interesting fireflies in many different ways, partly because at least some of the species, the females are predatory. The adult females are predatory. And this is a really interesting situation because it's only the adult females that are predatory. And the way it works in these predaceous Photuris is that the virgin females do like a regular firefly should. They sit around watching for males of their species. They see a male of their species that's doing everything right at the right time, so on and so forth. They signal back and forth, and then they mate. All right. Once they mate, those females then stop looking for male Photuris and start watching for male Photinus. And so if a a mated Photuris female sees a Photinus male go by, making his characteristic species flash, she'll mimic the flash of that species female. And the male will see that signal and he'll go, oh boy, there's a female. And he'll fly down to her, signaling as he goes, and she'll signal back to him as if she was that Photinus female. And then once he gets to her and lands on that leaf where she's sitting and runs over to shake hands, the female Photuris grabs him and eats him. And they do this because, as it turns out, most Photuris fireflies don't produce toxins. So they eat male Photinus to garner those protective toxins and use them to protect themselves and their eggs from predation, right? They're really agile predators. Sometimes they'll catch males in midair. They'll just snap them in the air. And sometimes they'll raid spider webs to get male Photinus for prey. Photuris is also interesting in that many of the species have multiple flash patterns. And a lot of these guys fly high up in the tree canopy. They're very difficult to study. They're confusing because their flash patterns are all over the place. So this genus, even though it's very conspicuous and sometimes occurs in huge numbers, you can go to Howell Woods in Johnston County at the right time of the year and see thousands of these things in the tree canopy, there's still an awful lot we need to learn about. Here are a couple other Photuris. So we got Photuris versicolor, Photuris tremulans, which is one of the Christmas light fireflies we see in large numbers at Stone Mountain and some other places. And that's a larval Photuris right there in my hand. All right, so real quickly, there are other glowing insects in North Carolina. There are some click beetles. Unfortunately, in North Carolina, we have no glowing click beetles, but actually the brightest glowing insect in the world is a click beetle from Central America. It's called the headlight beetle. Railroad worms, we're going to talk about real quickly here in a minute. And then in North Carolina, we also have a really cool glowing fly larva. So the railroad worms or glowworms are in the family Phengodidae. This is an adult female. Doesn't look like an adult, does it? They're called railroad worms because they have light organs along the sides of their body and they keep them on as they move through the forest floor. So that's a picture I took in my bathroom at 2 o'clock in the morning of one that was curled up on the floor. And this is a combination time lapse and flash picture. And so the flash picture shows you the insect, and the time lapse shows you where the light organs are. This is what it looks like in the dark. These things are about, as adult females, about 3 inches long. They're pretty spectacular. And they call railroad worms because it looks like a little subway car going through the forest floor. They prey primarily on millipedes. Sometimes you'll find them inside a hollowed out millipede shell where they've finished eating that millipede. One of the curious things about these guys is the males don't look anything at all like the females. That's a male Phengodid. And how that critter there mates with that critter there is a real puzzlement. Now, you may have heard of the glowworms in New Zealand and Australia. These are the larvae of a fungus gnat that aggregate in huge numbers on the ceilings of some caves. I was fortunate enough to see them in New Zealand about 20 years ago. But in North Carolina, we have our own glowworm fly. It's called Orphelia fultoni, and that's a picture of one right there. This is also a predator, just like the glowworms in Australia. And this is a really cool predator in that these larvae spin these webs, and then these little capsules are loaded with oxalic acid. So when something comes in, it gets punctured by those things and then poisoned by them, and then the larva eats the captured prey. These are also called foxfire worms, and in North Carolina, they're most common in the mountains. Usually you'll see them in moist road cut banks or overhangs of that sort. They have light organs at both ends. We think the light organs are used primarily to attract their prey into their little webs of death. This is the bluest light produced by any insect in the world, and it's one of the bluest lights produced by any bioluminescent organism in the world. So they're really, really cool. If you find an aggregation of them in the mountains, what you'll notice is it looks like kind of like a starry sky, but vertical. All right, real quickly, I'm going to try and wrap this up with some comments on conservation. Fireflies rely on different kinds of habitats. Some are edge critters like the Big Dipper and the double tap that I talked about earlier. Some are reliant on mature hardwood forests. Some are reliant on particular like cove forests near streams. Again, some are wetland specialists. There are firefly species that only will reproduce, and their larvae can only live in those semi-flooded habitats as you see here. There are even fireflies that are restricted to savanna habitats. So habitat is everything for fireflies, just like it is for most other wildlife. And habitat preservation is really, really important for them. We'll talk more about that in a second. Firefly watching is a really easy hobby. You've already probably done it. If you want to get serious about identifying them, you do need some way to measure and time their flash signals. If you want to capture them, you need a soft net so you don't damage the little guys. It's not bad to have a good beverage. That beer really helped me find the fireflies in my backyard. And if you need a light at night when you're looking for fireflies, studying fireflies, it's best to use one that's either red or blue. And I have a really neat story, but I'll save it for maybe if we have a little bit of time. So I talked about habitat. Threats to fireflies are many. Lots of fireflies, especially those with wingless females, have very little dispersal ability. So if you cause local extinction of a population through development or something like that, they're not going to come back for a very, very long time. So habitat loss is a huge issue for fireflies. Fragmentation of habitat is a huge issue. Conversion to other uses is a huge issue. Some non-native plants interfere with their ability to see each other. So you think about something like microstygium, that Japanese stilt grass that's everywhere anymore. When that stuff starts growing and there are female fireflies on the forest floor, males flying above them can't see them. Just as the same problem occurs where we have, not necessarily in North Carolina, but in other parts of the country where we have dense stands of buckthorn. If they can't see each other, they can't mate. One of the most important threats to fireflies is light pollution. They use light to communicate. If they can't see each other's lights, they're not going to be able to find each other. Light pollution is a growing threat, and there is data out there to show that the ambient incidence of light pollution, particularly in eastern North America, has increased dramatically over the last few decades. Of course, they're insects. Insecticide spraying for things like mosquitoes and other pests can have a big impact on local populations. If you don't want to damage the fireflies on your property, don't spray broadcast spray insecticides in that habitat. So, what can you do? Most fireflies have at least 1 year life cycles. That means they have to have a stable habitat throughout that period of time. The larval stages of fireflies are either subterranean or live in and under leaf litter. Maintaining leaf litter is a very, very good thing for fireflies. Protecting those habitats and trying to work towards not having them fragmented is a very, very good thing. And again, limit the use of insecticides as much as possible. Finally, light pollution is, as I said, a growing problem. On your own personal property, minimize as much as you can extraneous outdoor lighting. And so don't leave the porch light on unless you've got a good reason for it. If you don't need that security light lighting up half your property, have it turned off. Light pollution is a big problem for fireflies. There are a couple other projects in addition to ours that you can get involved with. There's a Firefly Atlas project that is being steered by the Xerxes Society. It's a conservation organization focused on invertebrates, in particular insects. So you can participate in this. It's an effort to try and map the occurrence of more species of fireflies. You'll find all kinds of good information at their website. This is a catalog of fireflies that are threatened or endangered. Some of them have already been listed as such, but some of them are probably still awaiting listing. Lots of fireflies are being threatened primarily by habitat fragmentation and light pollution and insecticides. So you can get involved in that. We also have in North Carolina, and I'm one of the leaders of this effort, a program to try and map the distribution of our fireflies. So if you're interested in fireflies, if you really have, pardon the pun, been bitten by the bug, we're looking for your data. And there are some good resources out there that help you learn fireflies, that help you understand them. The Firefly Atlas is one of them. As far as field guides go, I can recommend a very good field guide by a friend of mine named Lynn Faust, and it's Fireflies, Lightning Bugs, and Glowworms. I think that's more or less the title. You can find it on Amazon very easily, and I would tell you it's a very, very good book to have if you're interested in fireflies. All right, I do have a short video here, but I think I'll just let it go. And since I've taken a whole hour, I'll take questions if there's time for that to happen. And if we have time for my little video, I'll back up and we'll show you that too. So,
Thank you very much. What a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I certainly learned a lot. If you have any questions for Dr. Sorenson, you can go ahead and put those in the chat or in the Q&A feature, and I will ask them for you. Someone said they'd like to see the video.
okay, well, this is an old video of one of my heroes. A fellow y'all may have heard of called Attenborough, David Attenborough. Anyway, this goes into synchronous fireflies in another part of the world, and then it shows you a really cool trick you can do with that pen light that I recommended for you earlier in the evening. So this won't take very long, but it's really cool.
The only way of communicating at night. When the sun goes down here on the tidal rivers of Malaysia, the trees on the banks become alive with animals communicating with light. At first, there are just a few twinkles in the branches, but about 3/4 of an hour after sunset, the show begins. These are fireflies. Thousands and thousands of tiny beetles, only about 5 millimeters long, each sending a message in Morse code with a lantern in its abdomen. All males that are flapping are males, and their message, of course, is directed to the females, and it's a very simple one. Come hither, mate with me. This particular species, as well as one or two others here in Southeast Asia, reinforce that message and make sure it's sent the farthest possible distance by all flapping in perfect time together, in perfect synchrony. And the result is that even after I've drifted many yards downriver, looking back, I can still see their tree outlined with pulsing light.
By the way, this is an endangered phenomenon in Southeast Asia as well, because of the conversion of mangroves to shrimp farms.
This display continues throughout the hours of darkness every night of the year and extends for miles along the river. The combined light of all these tiny beetles is so bright that fishermen out at sea can use them as navigating beacons to guide them back to their home rivers. Only in Southeast Asia do fireflies coordinate their flashings in this spectacular way. Elsewhere in the world, fireflies operate independently, each beaming its own individual invitation to mate. Take a walk in the woodlands of the eastern United States at dusk in summer, and you can find fireflies all around you. And what's more, with these, you can actually communicate if you have a small torch like this. To communicate with the males, which are flying around about a foot above the ground, I have to accurately imitate the call of a female. In the species that's flashing now, the female observes the flash of the male and then waits 2 seconds and produces a half-second flash of her own, like this.
So this is the Big Dipper.
Let's see if I can do it. Ah, there's one. Flash, 2 for me. 2, flash. He's coming. Flash from him. 1, 2, flash from me. And here he comes. Here he comes. There we are. He settled on my finger. Got him. There he is. Well, I'm afraid I'm a disappointment to you. Communication with light is not restricted to the land.
And y'all, when you were little kids, raced all over the yard with a mason jar trying to catch them, and all you had to do was sit still with a flashlight.
Have a couple of questions.
Yes.
So a little bit more about the use of pesticides and particularly for mosquitoes, the mosquito Joe trucks and things like that, how that affects fireflies.
So yeah, any kind of broadcast application of insecticide has the potential to ding them. Now, they're most sensitive, probably most sensitive to that kind of application when the adults are active. When the larvae are down in the leaf litter, it's unlikely that they're going to be contacted by that insecticide. But you know, if they're spraying mosquitoes in May and June, then they quite likely are going to be killing some fireflies as well. So I would personally avoid that. I don't use very much, if any, insecticide on my property. Mostly what insecticide I use is in the house for the smoky brown cockroaches that I despise. Yeah.
And then are fireflies able to see different wavelengths of light? Do they produce any light in infrared?
So they probably don't perceive infrared. Lots of insects can detect ultraviolet, but that might not be particularly useful for fireflies because ultraviolet radiation is much less prominent at night. There's some reflecting from the moon, but it's not a lot. But they do see colors. So I know. I'll tell you the story real quickly. Several years ago, we were doing work on the pollination ecology of the Venus flytrap down in coastal North Carolina. And we had time-lapse cameras that we put out on the flowers overnight one time just to see if anything came to these pretty white flowers at night. We had abundant visitors during the day. We wanted to see if anything came at night. And we checked our video the next day, and fireflies were all over the flowers. Now, we'd set these video cameras up, these time-lapse cameras up with a little red headlamp shining on the flower so that the camera could see the flower, thinking most insects cannot see red. And so we saw fireflies all over the flowers. We're going, this is awesome. We've got the most charismatic, one of the most charismatic insects in the world on what is almost certainly one of the most charismatic plants in the world, pollinating it. Man, here we come, National Geographic. But in order to prove that, we had to go out and get some of those fireflies and see if they're carrying pollen. So the next night, we went out and with our nets and with our red headlamps on, and the fireflies flew at our heads. They had no interest whatsoever in the flowers. They were just attracted to the red lights. So they can see other colors. But it seems like red and blue bother them less than white lights, and red light will keep from damaging your night vision if you need to have a light at night. And then that's why I recommend red or blue if you need a headlamp at night when you're studying fireflies.
There's a question about the best time of year to see the local fireflies. Is late May or late April, early May typically the best time for some of our
So,
local?
so
Oh,
actually right here in my yard, I'm up to 13 species of fireflies. So, you live in Chatham County or Alamance County, you probably have, at least in your neighborhood, a fairly broad diversity of fireflies, and some of them will start flying in March. Now, the ones that come earliest, the ones that come in March, now they're usually going to be up in the tree, up in the tree canopy. But as we get into later April and then into May and early June, that's kind of the peak of firefly season around here. But there are a couple species that don't even come out, don't even start calling until July. So from March to July, you can find fireflies if you look in the right places and are diligent.
and so kind of building off of that, it's common to find different species together.
Um, so sort of. So I have a lot of different species in my yard because my yard's a pretty diverse patch of ground. I have about 4 acres, and about half of it's wooded and about half of it's open. And I also have a 1 acre pond. So I've got lots of different habitats for lots of different species. Um, but a lot of times what you'll notice is one species will be on the edge of the woods while another species is just inside the woods. Um, or one's flying over the marsh and another one's flying out over the open meadow. Um, so yeah, you will see species in close proximity, but if you study it, not a lot of times you'll notice that there are differences in exactly where they're hanging out. And one other important thing to know is that different species of fireflies have different times of night when they want to be active. Some of them, not many, are going to get active at dusk, well, before it's even dark, like the Big Dipper does. And some of the others won't do anything until it's flat dark, and so they won't even begin calling until 45 minutes or an hour after sunset. So exploiting that time difference is important as well.
And then we had a question about potential impacts of Hurricane Helene on fireflies in Western North Carolina.
That's a heck of a good question, and actually, one of my colleagues and I are interested in doing some work this coming season to see whether or not um, that storm had an impact on some of the fireflies. The biggest impact is probably going to be um, well, two areas. One, areas where the habitat was significantly modified by wind throws. So, there were large areas of forest that got knocked down. That's going to revert to early successional kinds of habitats. And so fireflies that rely on mature forest are probably going to fade locally in those areas, while those that kind of like earlier successional habitats are going to probably come up. And then it's hard to know exactly what the impact of river bottom flooding will be, but if land was inundated and the leaf litter was washed off, it's probably had a significant impact on the fireflies, at least in that local area that was inundated and eroded. So, yeah, we're actually going to go up this spring and see if we can get a handle on that. That's a heck of a good question, though.
Thank you. All right, if there are any last questions, you can type them in the chat. I did see that Jerry said he was tuning in with a beer in his hand.
I saw that too. That tickles me. That tickles me. Um, I would also tell anybody that's got an interest or has further questions or is interested in helping us with our collections. My email address is very easy to find. It's in the North Carolina State University directory, but it's Clyde_Sorenson, SON, at ncsu.edu. And I'm glad to answer any inquiries you might want to send my way via email.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. What a
Yes,
great
thank you.
presentation.
That was great.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun.
Good,
And
good.
fireflies are a lot of fun, and I advocate for everybody to get out, and we need to know more. And y'all are right in the heart of where our putative new species is, and so the more data we can get on that little rascal, the better. But don't ignore the rest of them because they're all really cool.
Mhm.
All right,
All right. Well, thank you.
bet.
Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
So did it go all right, you reckon?
Yes, sir. Yes, it did.
Oh, that was great. That was really great.
Super
Yeah,
awesome.
A
it
lot of
really
fun.
was fascinating. That's what everybody is saying.
Yeah,
And I
it's
love your
a lot.
stories.
A lot of fun to be a
Yes.
kid again at 66. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in looking for different kinds because I mean, I saw some near the ground, but I'm wondering if there are maybe some in the trees.
So you almost certainly have some higher in the canopy. You just a lot of the canopy flashers aren't going to start flashing until it's flat dark though.
Okay.
So if you're looking just at dusk, you're only going to see a limited suite of players. So, but
My partner.
I'd be surprised if you don't have half a dozen species in your neighborhood that you
Yeah,
can.
because we've got mature trees,
Mm.
forests for sure. And we have an empty lot. No, well, here too. We have a house in the mountains also, but our neighbor had floodlights. And I
Mhm.
mean, it did seriously reduce them.
Oh,
He's
if floodlights are bad. Yeah.
like
The-
all night long, but he's stopped now. So I'm hoping they'll
Good.
come back.
That's good. Yeah, that's it's not good to keep unnecessary extraneous light on all night. Now, most of them are going to. There are very few of them that are active much after midnight. But if you've got it on until midnight, you're probably messing with them.
He probably had them on all night for like a year or two. I'm hoping they'll come back. That's
Well,
really cool that we have the ghost ones here, though.
pardon?
That we have the ghost type here.
Yeah. This is really cool, and we're that genus. They just did a revision on it, but they didn't include our new material in it, so
Hmm.
it hasn't been described yet, and I'm virtually certain it's a new species. And
Hmm.
there may be others. There may be another new species in this group down in coastal South Carolina too. So there's the cool thing about that whole story is there's still discoveries to be made, even in
Yeah.
North Carolina, which has been studied to death.
Mhm.
There's still new things to find, and that's really the most important take home message from that whole thing, as far as I'm concerned. So.
How do you collect them?
That's tricky. You need a net because a lot of times when you get close, they turn their light off and then they just flat disappear.
Ah.
So I've got a really nice insect net with a real soft bag, and so I try and get close enough to nab them without getting close enough to make them turn their light off. But it's tricky. We oftentimes we collect them out of spider webs. And it's
Hmm.
pitiful to see the poor little rascal stuck in a spider web, but it makes it easier for us to get the specimen.
No.
Be a little glowing body in the web.
Ah.
It makes you sad, but there it is. spiders have to eat too.
Right, right.
I want to start looking for them in old millipede shells.
Oh yeah, the glowworms. So if you want to find them, the best time is again probably from late April into July. And you can just get in some good woods. It needs to be dark, dark though. If there's a lot, like even a lot of moonlight, it's harder to see them. But if it's dark, dark, and when you see them, you'll know it. Because like I said, they're about 3 inches long, and the green on them is quite bright. So if you see them, you'll know it.
Yeah.
And we need records on them too. I mean, they're they're pretty striking animals, but we don't have a lot of information on exactly where they are in North Carolina and all that too. So that's all good. Yep. All right. Anything
Awesome.
else?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Oh,
Yeah,
you
thank
bet.
you again.
You bet. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I
We
Us
enjoyed it.
too.
Y'all take
Yeah.
care.
Thanks. You the
You
same.
too.
Happy holidays.
You
Yeah.
too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.